My bent buttonhook opened the bench where my mother's missing tools had waited.
She was 18 and homeless. No room, no family tools, no promise of supper, just a bent iron buttonhook and $2 she had earned mending a widow's cuffs. And with those $2, she bought a forgotten iron buttonhook polishing room outside Lowell, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, erased from county maps in 1938. The north roof sagged beneath split slate. The polishing wheel had rusted to its shaft. The county condemned the room on October 3, 1941, with demolition planned for spring, yet beneath the wheel bench waited a narrow handle slot unopened for decades, holding the truth about her mother and enough money to alter every choice ahead. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sadie Finch had been polishing her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she rubbed dull spoons with wood ash, smoothed splinters from clothespins, and worried rough edges until they could no longer catch a sleeve. Her mother, Ruth, called it Sadie's careful hand. In the narrow rooms they rented near Lowell's mills, care was rarely praised unless it saved money, so Sadie learned to recognize approval in the quiet return of an object to her palm. Ruth repaired sewing tools for women whose wages depended upon speed. She straightened bodkins, sharpened embroidery scissors, and cleaned buttonhooks stained by damp boarding houses. Her fingers were broad at the joints, and a pale burn crossed one thumb where a buffing wheel had once taken the skin. But it was Ruth's father, Elias Finch, who taught Sadie the old work properly. Every Saturday before sunrise, she walked with him to a brick outbuilding behind his rented house in Pawtucketville. Elias unlocked the door with a key worn thin as a fish scale. Inside stood a foot-powered polishing wheel, 2 iron vices, and drawers filled with hooks sorted by curve and handle length. He made Sadie sweep first because grit beneath a shoe could travel to the bench and score finished iron. Then came the ritual. She tested each hook tip against a square of unbleached muslin. If it pulled a single thread, she filed it with 6 patient strokes, never 7, merely from habit. She rubbed the handle with emery mixed with lamp oil, held it lightly to the turning cloth wheel, and cooled it against her wrist before setting it down. At noon, Elias cut an apple in half with his pocket knife. They ate without leaving the bench, listening to the leather belt click over the pulley. "Make it safe for the cloth you'll never see," he told her. Sadie understood years later that he had not been speaking only of iron. Honest work was measured by the harm it prevented after the maker was gone. Elias died during a sleet storm in February 1939. By the time Sadie and Ruth reached his room, the landlord had carried the footwheel to the cellar, and distant cousins had divided the drawers as if they contained ordinary nails. Ruth recovered one bent buttonhook and Elias's blackened apron. She folded the apron into a flour sack and kept it beneath her bed. Ruth died 14 months later after a winter cough settled too deep for mustard plasters or borrowed medicine. Sadie went to live with Ruth's older sister, Della Finch, in a house where curtains remained closed even at noon. Della moved quietly, counted everything twice, and disliked questions that required memory. She gave Sadie a cot beside the pantry and kept Ruth's flour sack in the locked sewing cupboard. At first, Della said the tools would be safer there. Then she said Sadie was too young to use them. By the following autumn, the cupboard stood empty. Sadie found the flour sack behind the stove, flattened and smelling of coal smoke. Elias's apron was gone. So were Ruth's small files, oilstone scissors, brass thimbles, awls, and the wooden case holding 11 repaired hooks. Della sat at the kitchen table, winding gray thread around a card. The rent was due, she said. Sadie looked at the new brown shoes beside Della's chair and asked how much the tools had brought. Her aunt tightened the thread until the card bowed. On November 17, she returned from a laundry shift and found her mother's blue enamel wash basin on the front step. Inside lay 2 dresses, stockings, a comb with 3 missing teeth, and the bent buttonhook. Della stood behind the screen door with one hand resting on the latch. She did not look toward the wash basin. "You cannot stay here asking what I sold." Exactly 8 words spoken without anger. Sadie lifted the basin. The rim pressed a cold line into her forearms. Behind Della, the sewing cupboard door hung open, displaying clean shelves. That emptiness was the only answer her mother's sister offered. The latch clicked before Sadie reached the gate. For 6 weeks, she moved south and west whenever a doorway became familiar enough for someone to notice her. In Lowell, she slept 2 nights beneath the rear stairs of a boarding house on Lewis Street, waking before the cooks carried out ashes. Her $2 became $1.68 after bread, cheese, and a cup of coffee she regretted buying. She walked to Chelmsford and slept in an abandoned trolley shelter, wrapping newspaper beneath her dress to slow the wind. Rain reached her shoes before morning. A farm woman paid 12 cents for help sorting bruised apples, and Sadie spent 7 on biscuits. In Westford, she slept in a church coal shed until the sexton found her. He did not ask her name. He handed her a wool blanket, allowed her one night, and pointed toward the road at dawn. By then, she had $1.21. She returned toward Lowell because the mills, even when they refused her, offered steam grates and crowds in which a solitary girl disappeared. She slept beneath a loading platform in the women's waiting room at the depot until midnight, and once inside an unfinished grave shed beside a cemetery wall. She washed in public lavatories, dried her stockings beneath her coat, and used the button hook to fasten boots for elderly women outside the station. A nickel here, 3 cents there. At the end of the 6th week, she possessed $2 exactly because she had begun refusing food whenever spending would take her below that number. On December 29, she entered the Lowell Public Library to thaw her hands. She chose a newspaper because reading looked respectable and because the radiator beside the classified table knocked with dependable heat. The final page carried notices for scrap machinery tax lots, condemned sheds, and buildings offered for removal. One advertisement had been boxed in pencil. Iron button hook polishing room, $2. Structure and contents as found. Deed transfer at county office. Demolition order pending. Below it, someone had written an old road name and the initials EF. Sadie laid the bent hook across the advertisement. The iron curve matched the black printed words as though both had been waiting for the same hand. The librarian provided a county map and did not object when Sadie copied the route onto the back of a discarded catalog card. The property lay beyond the last regular bus stop, nearly 30 miles by road. Sadie spent nothing that afternoon. She filled her pockets with the directions, returned the newspaper to its rack, and walked to the depot before the temperature fell. At sunrise, carrying the wash basin no longer and owning almost nothing that could be sold, Sadie Finch boarded the westbound bus with $2 sewn into her hem. By nightfall, she would learn why a dead man's initials had been written beneath the advertisement. The bus carried Sadie 21 miles before the driver stopped beside a frozen crossroads and told her the route went no farther west. She walked the remaining 8 miles beneath a sky the color of unpolished iron. The catalog cards softened in her glove as she checked the penciled turns north at the stone wall west where the road divided beside a dead elm, then follow the low ground toward the Concord River. By dusk, her left heel had opened inside her shoe. A hay barn stood beyond a field rimmed with frost. Sadie waited until the farmhouse lamps went dark, then climbed through a loose board and buried herself beneath dry timothy. The night fell to 19 degrees. Hay scratched her cheeks, mice worked somewhere below, and each breath gathered white above her face. She slept with the bent button hook inside her fist. At first light, she walked on. The settlement outside Lowell announced itself without a proper sign. There was Hanley's Hardware beneath a striped awning, Bell & Sons feed with cracked grain scattered across its threshold. Doris Vale's Riverside Cafe, breathing coffee steam onto the windows. Merrimack Shoe Repair with 3 boots hanging above the door, and Pritchard Coal and Ice, where a black horse stood patiently between the shafts. Sadie paused only long enough to ask directions to the county office. The cafe owner, a square woman with flour on one sleeve, pointed with a coffee spoon toward a granite building 2 streets uphill. Inside, heat rose from iron radiators and carried the smell of wet wool, ink, and floor wax. A clerk sat behind a high counter beneath a green-shaded lamp. She had silver hair braided tightly against her head and a dark crescent of ink along the side of one finger. Her brass nameplate read MRS, Agnes Wetherell Deeds and Assessments. Sadie placed the advertisement on the counter. Mrs. Wetherell read it once, then looked at Sadie's coat, her swollen shoes, and the damp catalog card. You have the purchase price. Sadie loosened 3 stitches in her hem and placed 2 worn dollar bills beneath the lamp. The clerk did not touch them. You understand the building is condemned? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no water service? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not repair the road? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition may proceed after the thaw? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Wetherell studied her for several seconds. Then she opened a ledger wide enough to cover half the counter and drew out a deed already marked with the property description. The room was listed as a detached workshop 24 feet by 31 on less than half an acre beside an abandoned mill channel. Sadie signed where the clerk placed a ruler. Mrs. Wetherell pressed a brass seal into a red ink pad, set it over the paper, and leaned down with both hands. The stamp landed with a sound like a small door closing. You will take School Street north, she said. Turn left onto Pawtucket Boulevard, continue past the old pumping station, then use the unmarked lane after the second stone culvert. The lane bends east beneath walnut trees. The workshop is the last structure before the marsh. She slid the deed forward, but her hand remained on its edge. Finch, she said quietly. Was Elias Finch your relation? Sadie's fingers stopped above the paper. I was my grandfather. Mrs. Wetherell sat back. The radiator knocked twice behind her. He came here every April to pay the assessment on that room, even after the trade had closed. Never late, never sent another person. She opened a narrow drawer and removed a bundle of old receipts tied with cotton tape. The final payment was made 8 months before he died. Sadie looked at the signatures. The E leaned backward. The F crossed the same way Elias had marked tool handles with a cold chisel. Why would he keep paying for a place he never mentioned? I cannot answer that. Mrs. Wetherell untied one receipt and turned it toward the light. But when the condemnation notice was entered, he asked that the property be sold, whole contents included, for $2. $2 exactly. He said a person with more money would tear it apart for salvage. A person with less could not reach it. The clerk released the deed. Sadie folded it once and placed it inside her dress, close to the catalog card. Mrs. Wetherill took $1 from the counter, opened the center drawer of her desk, and laid it flat beneath a stack of forms. "The filing fee is $1, she said. "The other should remain with the property owner." Sadie understood the kindness and did not argue. She slipped the second bill back into her hem. Outside, the afternoon had brightened without growing warmer. She followed School Street north past brick mill houses with laundry frozen stiff on their lines and turned onto Pawtucket Boulevard, where the river moved dark beneath broken rims of ice. At the first stone culvert, a man splitting kindling watched her pass. At the second, a thin woman in a red scarf stood beside a mailbox while a yellow hound strained at its rope. "You looking for the Finch place?" the woman called. Sadie nodded. The dog barked once, then sneezed into the snow. "Lane is nearly gone," the woman said. "Keep the walnut trunks on your right. Ground drops off sharp near the channel." Sadie thanked her and entered the unmarked lane. Walnut trees leaned above it, their black branches holding small pockets of old snow. The road had become two frozen ruts divided by brown grass. Her shoes sank through the crust twice, and once she caught herself against a trunk, leaving a dark print from her glove. The building appeared gradually through the branches. It was lower than she had imagined, built of red brick over a fieldstone foundation, approximately 24 feet wide and 31 feet deep, just as the deed described. The north wall carried a pale seam where another structure had once joined it. Slate was missing from the roof above the back corner, and the ridge bowed several inches at the center. A square brick chimney rose from the western slope, its top course loosened by frost. Over the front door hung a wooden sign with only fragments of lettering left beneath gray paint. "Finch Ironwork button hooks polished and repaired." Sadie touched the last visible word. The door resisted until she lifted it by the iron latch and pressed her shoulder against the panels. Something scraped across the floor inside. When the gap widened, air moved out, carrying cold soot, old oil mouse nests, and the mineral scent of rust. She stepped into the front room. Light entered through two cracked windows and fell in narrow bars across a counter, a wall of shallow drawers and shelves lined with button-hook handles furred orange at the edges. The floor gave a dry complaint beneath her right foot. Somewhere inside the wall, water ticked slowly through a pipe that no longer served anything. Sadie removed one glove and ran her fingers along the counter. Dust gathered against her skin, fine as flour but bitter with metal. When she touched the fingertip to her lip without thinking, she tasted iron. A doorway led to the back workroom. There the polishing bench stood beneath a long window, its cloth wheel blackened and stiff, its treadle trapped beneath a fallen board. A file lay beside the vise as though its owner had set it down between jobs. In one corner, curled shavings of leather had hardened into dark rings. She pushed the treadle with her boot. The wheel moved less than an inch and stopped with a low wooden groan. The sound traveled through the bench and returned from somewhere below it. Sadie crouched, but the light was failing and the cold had begun to settle through her wet stockings. She left the bench untouched. In a rear cupboard, she found a dented tin cup, 2 candles gnawed by mice, and a box of matches wrapped in waxed paper. Only 6 matches remained. She lit one candle and carried it through the rooms, watching the flame bend toward cracks she would need to close. There was no bed. She swept a space beside the front counter with a broken horsehair brush, spread her coat on the boards, and placed the deed beneath it to keep the paper dry. Her supper was half a biscuit saved from the road and water melted from clean snow in the tin cup over the candle flame. Night gathered early around the workshop. The chimney clicked as the temperature fell. Walnut branches brushed the roof in slow, deliberate strokes. Sadie lay on her side with the bent button-hook beneath her cheek and listened until she could distinguish the scrape of mice from the settling of brick. Before sleep, she reached into her hem and touched the remaining $1. Then she placed her palm flat against the floor. The room had been waiting for her. Sadie spent her first morning following animal tracks downhill until she found the well. It stood 30 yards behind the workshop beneath a roof of split cedar, its stone curb hidden under snow. The rope had rotted through, but the iron pulley still turned. She tied the tin cup to a length of sash cord found in a drawer, lowered it 14 feet, and brought up water clear enough to show the scratches inside the cup. She boiled it before drinking. The outhouse leaned beyond the walnut trees. One hinge had torn loose, and snow lay across the seat. Sadie repaired the door with 2 bent nails straightened against the workshop threshold, then marked the safer path with sticks because the ground near the abandoned channel dropped suddenly beneath the drifts. By the 3rd day, she knew the language of the floor. The board beside the front counter snapped sharply when stepped upon. 2 planks near the chimney groaned in sequence. The back room gave a low, hollow note beneath the polishing bench, but only when her weight fell near its left leg. She did not investigate it yet. Keeping the building warm enough to work mattered first. Sadie walked into town carrying the cracked chimney brush she had found behind the cupboard. Hanley's hardware smelled of rope linseed oil, leather gloves, and the warm dust from a coal stove. Wooden bins held nails by the pound. Glass jars of screws stood behind the counter like dark preserves. Mr. Hanley emerged from an aisle with a pencil tucked through the white hair above his ear. The tip had left a gray line across his temple. He turned the broken brush in his hands, tested the bristles with his thumb, and asked where she had found it. The Finch polishing room. His eyes lifted. So you are the girl Agnes sent west. Sadie did not know whether Mrs. Wetherill had sent anyone, but she placed her remaining dollar on the counter. I need enough to clean the chimney and free the wheel. Mr. Hanley drew a sheet of brown paper toward him. You need more than $1. I can work. I have a boy for sweeping. I can keep an account. He looked at her coat and then at the broken brush again. What security do you have? Sadie placed Elias's bent button hook beside the dollar. Mr. Hanley pushed it back with one finger. A tool is not security if losing it makes the borrower poorer. He opened a ledger, wrote Sadie Finch on a clean line, and beneath it added workshop account limit $5. You pay when you can, no interest before June. Yes, sir. And read this before climbing anything. He handed her a stained booklet titled Repairs for the Small Property Owner. Its cover showed a man standing too confidently on a ladder. Sadie purchased a replacement chimney brush for 65 cents, 20 feet of jointed rod for 48, a pint of penetrating oil for 22, a pound of 8-penny nails for 9, 5 feet of stove gasket for 18, and a small wire hand brush for 11 cents. Mr. Hanley wrote every price beneath her name and returned her dollar untouched. The chimney took most of the next day. Sadie first laid damp newspaper across the hearth and sealed the opening with a flour sack pinned under 2 bricks. From the roof, she removed the loose top brick by hand, tied the brush rod to her wrist, and worked downward in short strokes. The first pass released only gray dust. The second brought flakes of creosote thick as bark. The rod jammed 9 feet below the crown. She climbed down, opened the lower cleanout, and pushed upward with the broken handle of a broom until a black mass dropped against the flour sack. It smelled sharp and tarry like burned medicine. She carried the debris outside in the wash basin lid she had found beneath the counter, then repeated the brushing from both ends. 5 hours passed before the bristles emerged without glaze. She inspected the mortar joints with a candle held inside the firebox. Light showed through one seam near the floor. Sadie packed it temporarily with stove gasket and clay scraped from beneath the well curb, knowing it would need proper mortar before winter deepened. She built the first fire from walnut twigs, 2 pieces of split pine, and a fist-sized lump of coal given to her by the man at Pritchard's yard. Smoke rolled into the room, making her eyes water. She opened the front door, warmed the flue by burning a twist of newspaper near the throat, and tried again. This time the smoke rose cleanly. Sadie sat on the floor until the bricks began giving back heat. In the tin cup, she boiled water with a sliced potato, half an onion from Doris Vale, and a spoonful of barley Mr. Hanley had poured into a paper twist without entering it in the ledger. The meal tasted faintly of rust. It was hot. That afternoon she began the workroom inventory. She chose only objects that could still serve. A 6-inch mill file lay beneath the bench, its teeth clogged but straight. A narrow burnisher rested in a leather sleeve hardened by age. There were 3 wooden handle blanks, an iron vise with 1 missing jaw pad, a stone jar containing dried polishing compound, 2 cloth wheels dark with grease, and a tin of buttonhook tips wrapped in oil paper. On the wall hung a gauge Elias had made from sheet brass. Sadie recognized his backward-leaning F stamped near the edge. She cleaned the file with the wire brush, soaked the treadle joints in penetrating oil, and removed the fallen board pinning the mechanism. The leather belt had cracked almost through. Still, when she pressed the treadle, the shaft turned half a revolution. A faint knock came from inside the bench. Sadie stopped. She turned the wheel by hand. The knock returned at the same point in every revolution, but the shaft was straight and nothing touched the housing. She placed her ear against the wooden top and tapped along its length with the handle of the wire brush. Over the drawers, the sound was dense. Above the treadle, it became hollow. Beneath the wheel, it changed again. She emptied the bench drawers and weighed each in her hands. The lowest drawer was shallow yet heavier than the one above it. Its back panel measured nearly 4 inches thick from the outside, but less than 2 inside. Sadie removed the drawer. Behind it was a narrow opening shaped like the hollow handle of an oversized tool. A round cedar disc had been fitted into the slot, its grain aligned so carefully with the surrounding wood that dust concealed the seam. She tried the tip of her knife and stopped when the cedar began to split. The bent button hook lay on the bench. Its curved end entered a small hole at the disc's center as though the two had been made together. Sadie turned the handle 1/4 turn. A wooden catch released. The disc slid forward against the hook. Cold cedar air escaped from the compartment. Sadie placed the disc aside and reached into the slot. Her fingertips touched oilcloth. The first package was long and narrow. She carried it to the front counter, unfolded the blackened cloth, and found Elias's fine files arranged in stitched pockets. Each tang bore a different mark for its cut, 1 line, 2 lines, a triangle, a small cross. Ruth had taught Sadie from those marks before she could read their proper names. The second package held raw materials: iron rods no thicker than knitting needles, 6 unfinished handles of ebony and bone strips of crocus cloth, and 3 cakes of polishing compound wrapped in wax paper. One cake still smelled faintly of tallow when she scraped it with her nail. A third bundle contained Ruth's brass thimbles, her oilstone, and the small scissors with the left bow wrapped in blue thread. Sadie held the scissors closed in both hands. She did not test the blades. At the rear of the compartment stood a tin document box secured by a sliding clasp. Sadie set it beneath the lamp. Inside were savings certificates wrapped in groups of 10 and tied with linen cord. The first bore Elias Finch's name. The next was made payable to Ruth Finch. Later certificates had been left unsigned on the transfer line. Their dates stretched across more than 30 years. Sadie counted each bundle twice. $27,300 in face value. Beneath the certificates lay an old repair ledger, its cloth cover worn white at the corners. Sadie opened only the first few pages. The columns named Mill Women Boarding House addresses, tools repaired, and charges forgiven. Mabel Crowley 2 hooks burrs removed, no charge, mill closed. Norabel scissors ground, all replaced, no charge, 3 children. Anna Papa's complete hand kit, pay when work returns. The entries continued for hundreds of lines. At the bottom of the box sat a small canvas purse. It contained 23 Indian head cents, 7 Liberty nickels, 4 Barber dimes, and 3 worn silver quarters. Together they came to $1.73. Sadie arranged them by type, then returned every coin to the purse. Beside it lay a military medal on a faded ribbon. The bronze face carried an eagle and the words, "Great War for Civilization." Along the edge, a careful hand had scratched E. Finch, 1918. Under the medal rested a sealed envelope. Sadie was written across it. The handwriting belonged to Elias. She placed the envelope on the counter but did not open it. There was still daylight, yet she could not remain within the walls. She wrapped the tools again, returned the certificates to the box, and carried only the ledger outside. Beyond the walnut trees, the old mill channel had widened into a dark basin where the current met the river. Ice moved along its edges in thin plates, touching and separating without sound. Sadie sat on the stone curb of the well with the closed ledger across her knees. A muskrat crossed the black water, leaving a narrow wake. Farther downstream, a factory whistle marked the end of a shift no one in the polishing room had heard for years. Sadie watched until the page edges grew damp beneath her fingers. Then she returned inside, set the unopened letter beside the cold iron wheel, and turned the cedar disc face down on the bench. The room had been waiting for her. Morning entered through the cracked front windows in pale strips. Sadie warmed her hands over the stove, then carried the sealed envelope to the counter. The ink had browned, but Elias's handwriting remained unmistakable. Each capital leaned backward as though resisting the direction of time. She broke the seal with Ruth's small scissors. "My dear one, whoever you are. If you have opened the handle slot, then you have already done 2 things correctly. You listened before forcing the wood, and you kept the old hook long enough to find its purpose. That is sufficient proof for me. Dr. Samuel Breck at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston has told me that the weakness in my hands is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He spoke carefully, but I have repaired enough worn mechanisms to know what cannot be reversed. My fingers will fail first. After that, I do not expect much useful time. You should know whose room this was. My grandmother, Margaret Finch, born in Manchester, New Hampshire in 1844, came to Lowell in 1862 and polished hooks for women dressing before mill shifts. Her son Josiah Finch, born here in 1870, built this workshop in 1896 beside the old channel. His daughter Eleanor Finch, born in Lowell in 1878, kept the accounts and trained girls dismissed from the cloth rooms. I, Elias Finch, born in 1899, inherited the wheel, the ledgers, and the habit of opening the door before asking whether a woman could pay. Your mother Ruth was the 4th generation to learn the work, though the room had already gone quiet. The trade closed on October 14, 1936. There has been more than 30 years of silence since the last regular order crossed this bench. Some will say the work ended because buttons changed and boots no longer required hooks. That is partly true. Work also ends when people decide a small tool has no history worth keeping. My older brother Thomas Finch was killed in the Meuse-Argonne offensive on October 9, 1918. The medal in the box belonged to him. Our mother received it after the armistice and never wore it. Thomas had shaped hook handles here before he enlisted. He could polish ebony without rounding its corners, which is harder than it sounds. If you mean to work again, remember the order. Warm iron only enough to loosen old oil, never beyond 180 degrees Fahrenheit, or thin hooks may lose temper. Mix rotten stone with lamp oil at 3 parts powder to 1 part oil and use less than you believe necessary. Hold the hook tip to the cloth wheel for no longer than 4 seconds before cooling it against bare skin. When removing a burr file away from the curve in 6 even strokes, test on muslin, then stop. A 7th stroke done from pride can ruin an honest tool. The certificates are not a reward. They are stored wages from years when the room earned more than we required. Use them to make the building sound, to keep yourself fed, and to protect the work from haste. Do not mistake money for inheritance. The inheritance is knowing when iron is smooth enough that it will not tear a stranger's cuff. The ledger contains names of women who received tools without payment after layoffs, fires, illness, and widowhood. Many returned later with coins. Some never did. The work was still paid for because they kept sewing. If Ruth is the one reading this, forgive me for hiding what I feared others would sell. If it is Ruth's child, then I am sorry I did not place these things directly into your hands. If it is a stranger, use them honestly, and you will not remain one for long. Behind the workshop, beyond the walnut nearest the well, you will find a low granite marker cut with a hooked line. Keep the ground clear there. It marks the first wheelstone from Josiah's shop, not a grave. Light the old brass oil lamp before your first night of work. Eleanor used it while entering repairs, and Ruth cleaned the burner the last spring she came here. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Matthew Finch, April 2, 1832. Sadie read the letter once without moving. The second time she followed each line with one finger pausing where Elias had pressed hard enough to score the paper. Then she folded it along its original creases exactly as his hands had folded it and placed it inside the ledger. She went through the back door carrying the bent button hook. Snow had crusted around the well, but the ground beneath the nearest walnut lay partly bare where the branches had sheltered it. Sadie cleared leaves with her glove and found a granite marker no higher than her ankle. A hooked line had been carved across its face, ending in a small square like the handle of a button hook. She knelt and brushed dirt from the groove. Beside the stone lay a circular depression filled with frozen water. Beneath it, just visible through the ice, was the edge of an old wheelstone. Josiah's first polishing wheel had been laid flat in the earth, its working surface turned toward the sky. Sadie did not attempt to lift it. She set the bent hook on the marker for a moment, then returned it to her pocket. Inside, she searched the rear cupboard until she found the brass oil lamp. Its chimney was smoked black, and the wick had hardened in the burner. She cleaned the glass with newspaper, trimmed away the charred edge, and filled the reservoir with a small measure of lamp oil from the workbench jar. The first match failed. The second caught. A narrow flame rose beneath the chimney, trembled, then steadied. Light spread across the repair ledger, the file marks on the bench, and Ruth's scissors resting in their blue-threaded bow. Sadie placed the lamp where Eleanor might once have kept it. She began to understand the room through the people who had helped her reach it. Mrs. Wetherill had left $1 in a desk drawer instead of collecting it. Mr. Hanley had opened a credit line without taking Elias's hook. Doris Vale had given her an onion and refused to name it charity. The unnamed sexton in Westford had offered one blanket and one protected night, asking nothing that would make the gift harder to carry. Perhaps most lives were not changed by grand rescues. Perhaps they were kept moving by doors left unlatched, warm cups placed near cold hands, and debts recorded without shame. Before the story moves forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they did not have to. Tell us what it was and if you can pass the same kindness quietly to another person. That night, Sadie wrapped the files in Elias's apron, laid Ruth's scissors and oilstone beside her blanket, and placed the letter beneath the brass lamp. She slept with the heirlooms within reach of both hands. The first snow came on December 3 and left 6 inches against the north wall, enough to show Sadie exactly where the roof leaked. By noon, 3 dark circles had spread across the ceiling, and one drop fell steadily into Ruth's old wash basin. She read the roofing chapter in Mr. Hanley's manual 3 times before climbing the ladder. The roof measured 24 by 31 feet, with 2 slopes steep enough to shed water once the broken slate was gone. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 18 squares of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of felt, and nearly 20 pounds of galvanized nails. She wrote the numbers in the margin beside a grease mark left by another reader. Mr. Hanley studied the list, then reached beneath his counter and brought out a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a narrow gauge cut into the blade. "It belonged to my brother," he said. "He will not be needing it." Sadie accepted it with both hands. The elder who appeared the next morning was Silas Boone, a former roofer with one clouded eye and hands shaped by old fractures. He arrived carrying a chalk line and refused the coins Sadie placed on the sill. "You can pay me by keeping it dry." They stripped the damaged slate first, working from the ridge downward. Beneath it, one rafter had split along a knot. Silas showed her how to sister it with a sound spruce board bolted beside the weakened timber. They stretched felt from eave to ridge, snapping each course straight with blue chalk. Sadie learned his 3-stroke nail technique, set, drive, finish. No wasted blows, no dented shingle. On the 5th day, Silas tapped one nail with his thumb. "That nail's proud, pull it." Sadie drew it cleanly. On the 9th, she reached too far across a course. "Move your feet, not your spine." The work lasted 11 days. Wind stiffened, the felt snow melted beneath their boots, and every evening Sadie carried the tools down before darkness could make the ladder uncertain. By December 14, the ridge was capped, the north slope lay straight, and the workshop kept an entire night of sleet outside. Sadie stood beneath the repaired ceiling, listening for the wash basin. Nothing fell. January exposed what fire had hidden. The chimney bricks above the roofline were spalling their faces, peeling off in thin red shells. Inside the workroom, mortar powdered beneath Sadie's fingernail and collected along the hearth like pale grit. Silas would not touch chimney masonry, so Sadie returned to the manual and questioned Mr. Hanley until he drew the joint profile on wrapping paper. She mixed 2 parts hydraulic lime with 1 part sifted sand and 1 part fire clay for the hot inner courses, adding water slowly until the mortar held a trowel mark without slumping. She removed only 3 bricks at a time. For 3 weeks, the temperature stayed in the 20s. Sadie worked barehanded because gloves dulled her sense of pressure. Every 15 minutes, her fingers went numb. She climbed down, held them near the stove until pain returned, then climbed back with another pan of mortar. She replaced 6 fractured bricks, reset the loose crown, and packed the interior joints with a narrow pointing tool made from an old spoon handle. Each evening, she covered the fresh work with burlap so frost would not pull the moisture out too quickly. On January 28, after the final joint had cured, she built a test fire no larger than 2 fists. The smoke rose through the flue without pausing. Outside, it left the chimney in a clean gray column and drifted east above the walnut trees. Sadie watched until the last coal settled. The room smelled only of warm brick. The white pine floor looked black until Sadie pulled the first hand-cut rosehead nail from a loose plank and saw the wood protected beneath its head. She rented a random orbit sander from Hanley's for $14 per day. Mr. Hanley entered the charge in the ledger and warned her not to hold the machine still even for a breath. Sadie began with 80 grit paper, moving with the grain and stopping often to set proud nails below the surface. The first pass lifted a century of soot wax and metal dust. The second at 120 grit softened the machine marks. The final 220 grit pass left the board smooth enough that a folded cloth traveled from wall to wall without catching. Fine dust entered everything. She found it inside her sleeves, between the ledger pages, and along the oil lamp's wick. After vacuuming the cracks with a borrowed hand pump, she warmed the room and brushed on the first coat of boiled linseed oil. 2 more coats followed, each thin enough to enter the grain without pooling around the nail heads. Then she waited through a full 48-hour cure. The boards changed from dark honey near the windows to a deeper mahogany beneath the polishing bench. Old repairs became visible rather than hidden, a narrow patch beside the stove, a square where machinery had once stood, and dozens of heel marks gathered before the counter. One morning before the final coat, Sadie woke unable to lift the brush. She walked to the marsh and sat on the frozen bank. A great blue heron stood in shallow water between 2 shelves of ice, motionless except for the careful lowering of 1 foot. Sadie watched it for nearly an hour. She did no work that day. The next morning, she returned to the floor and finished the final coat without hurrying. 8 windows faced the road, marsh, and walnut trees. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The 8th held an original pane dated 1788 in a faint scratched hand near the lower sash, its surface wavering enough to bend every branch outside. Sadie preserved that pane. She removed the other sashes, softened old putty with gentle heat, and scraped the rabbets clean without driving the knife into the wood. New glass was bedded in a thin layer of DAP 33 glazing putty, pressed until a narrow line appeared on the interior side. She set the glazier's points flat, then drew the outer putty into a bevel that shed water away from the muntins. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Sadie replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, tying a figure-8 knot large enough to seat against each cast iron counterweight. The first sash dropped too quickly. She opened the pocket again, shortened the cord, and tried once more. By the 7th window, her hands knew the correct length before she measured. She saved the old 1788 pane for last. Its lower rail had softened, but the glass remained whole. Sadie consolidated the wood with warm glue, reset the surviving points, and pressed fresh putty around the trembling edge without removing it from the sash. As she smoothed the final corner, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch outside. It turned its black-capped head toward the glass, gave 1 dry note, and remained there while Sadie lowered the repaired sash into place. Behind the stove, the old plaster had separated from hand-split oak lath and bowed outward like damp paper. Horsehair showed through the broken edges, still binding lime that had been mixed before Elias was born. Sadie's first patch fell before morning. The second cracked beside the chimney. The third remained soft for 2 days, then slid down the wall when the stove warmed. Mr. Hanley brought her an old burlap bag of horsehair left from his brother's repairs. Sadie washed it, cut it short, and mixed it into fresh lime plaster. She pressed a scored scratch coat between the laths, waited until it held beneath her thumb, then spread a 3/8-inch brown coat. It cured for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final coat measured 1/8 inch and was smoothed with a steel trowel until the surface caught the window light. Sadie rested her palm against the hardened wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Vale began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. Sadie always knew they came from the cafe because the tops were folded twice and secured with a wooden toothpick. Inside, she found heel ends of bread, boiled eggs, apples with 1 bruised side, and once a square of molasses cake wrapped in wax paper. Doris had strong red wrists and wore a silver thimble on a chain around her neck. When Sadie carried 3 empty bags back to the cafe and placed coins beside the register, Doris swept the money into Sadie's palm without counting it. "In candles when the shop reopens," she said. Sadie folded the bags flat and kept them beneath the counter. Caleb arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle with mud dried along both fenders. He was 15, narrow at the shoulders, and wore one trouser leg clipped at the ankle. A splitting maul lay across his handlebars, tied there with clothesline. Without asking permission, he began breaking the walnut rounds Sadie had stacked near the well. He split each piece cleanly, turned the larger halves, and worked until the woodpile stood beneath the eave in even rows. Sadie offered him 50 cents. He shook his head and tightened the rope around the maul. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all. Reverend Boyd walked past each morning at 7. He was a tall man with polished boots, a brown overcoat brushed thin at the elbows, and a hat he tipped whether Sadie stood outside or watched from behind the glass. On the coldest morning of February, he stopped beside the gate while she struggled with a frozen bucket rope. He held the bucket steady until she freed the knot, then placed 2 fingers against the brim of his hat. Keep her walls standing. After that, he continued toward town. Sadie postponed the cellar until February 11. The door beneath the rear stairs had swollen shut, and the hinges carried so much rust that she removed them instead of forcing the latch. Stone steps descended into cold darkness. She lit Elias's brass lamp and counted 7 granite treads before reaching the floor. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet. Fieldstones had been laid flat beneath a skin of silt, and water shone in the lowest joints. At the center stood a dressed granite slab nearly 4 feet long, marked with the same hooked line carved into the wheelstone marker. Sadie cleared its edges but did not lift it. The slab had waited through several generations. It could wait until she understood what moving it might disturb. While scraping mud from the 3rd step, she felt wood beneath the iron tool. A small oak box had been wedged into the hollow below the tread. Its lid opened without a lock. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped into a curved button hook. Beneath the key was a tintype wrapped in faded blue cloth. It showed a young woman standing outside the workshop in summer, one hand resting on the signpost and the other holding a long iron hook. Her hair was pinned high, her mouth remained serious. Except for the old dress and the fullness of her sleeves, the face was Sadie's own. On the back, scratched into the black metal, were the words, "Eleanor Finch, daughter of Josiah, age 25, summer of 1903. Sadie carried the tintype upstairs and placed it beside the repair ledger. The brass key went on a nail above the mantel. She tried it in the front door, the document box, the counter drawers, and every cupboard lock. It fit nothing. There it remained, catching the lamp flame whenever Sadie crossed the room. In March, the snow retreated from the south wall first. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with meltwater, and pale green catkins lengthened along the walnut branches. Sadie could have begun polishing finished button hooks then. The wheel turned smoothly, the chimney drew, and Elias's materials waited in their wrappings. She chose not to. Instead, she spent 1 Indian head cent from the canvas purse on scrap iron purchased through Mr. Hanley. She filed short samples, heated them carefully, and practiced holding each against the cloth wheel for 4 seconds before cooling it against her wrist. Some pieces blue-stained, others rounded at the edges. She kept every failure in a shallow drawer. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 7, 2024, Sadie finished the first button hook made entirely by her own hands. She forged the hook from narrow iron rod, filed the curve until it passed through muslin without lifting a thread, and fitted it into an ebony handle from Elias's hidden bundle. 3 parts rotten stone and 1 part lamp oil darkened the polishing cloth. She counted 4 seconds against the wheel, cooled the iron on her wrist, then repeated the motion until the handle held a quiet, deep shine. The finished tool was not flawless. One side of the ebony showed a faint, flat place where her grip had tightened. Sadie left it. On a honest tool could carry the evidence of learning. The restored room no longer resembled a ruin, though it had not been made new. The white pine boards showed their patches. The 1788 window still bent the view of the marsh. Elias's lamp stood on the counter, and Ruth's scissors hung above the bench in their leather loop. The drawers held files, cleaned but not over-polished. Paper bags from Doris had become labels. Caleb's split walnut warmed the stove. The repaired walls met old plaster and visible, careful seams. On the morning after the first hook was finished, Sadie walked outside to gather fallen branches. Snow had settled into the fork of the largest walnut. As she pulled a branch free, her glove struck metal beneath the bark. A narrow brass plate had been set into the trunk years earlier and nearly swallowed by new growth. Its outline formed the same hooked mark carved on the granite slab. At the center waited a keyhole. Sadie returned with the brass key from the mantel. It entered without resistance. The plate released a small iron door fitted inside the hollow trunk. Behind it stood a cedar box wrapped in tarred cloth. The contents remained dry: a folded 48-star American flag, a photograph of Thomas Finch in uniform, and a note written by Eleanor during the First World War. September 29th, Sadie. Thomas, your last letter says the mud has entered everything, including the bread. I have placed the old flag here because Mother cannot bear to see it above the mantel while you are away. When you return, you may hang it yourself. The shop is quiet without your hammer. I have left the ebony handle you shaped in the second drawer. No one else can make the corners remain so exact. If this note is found by another generation, carry the flag to him if we never had the chance. Your sister Eleanor. Sadie read the final sentence again, then looked through the bare branches toward the river. Thomas had not returned to hang the flag. The medal from the tin box had been awarded after his death, and the family had kept both objects apart, perhaps because grief sometimes survived by dividing itself into pieces small enough to store. On November 11, 2025, Sadie carried the folded flag and medal to Lowell Cemetery. The armistice anniversary was cold and clear. Thomas Finch's name appeared on a family marker near the soldier's lot, the dates 1896 to 1918 cut beneath a shallow cross. There was no ceremony. Sadie brushed leaves from the stone, laid the medal over the folded flag, and remained until the 11 o'clock bells finished sounding across the city. Then she took both objects home because Eleanor's note had asked that they be carried to him, not abandoned there. The saving certificates remained in the document box. Sadie redeemed only enough to purchase the building's tax title, roof materials, chimney brick, and a legal bond protecting the workshop from demolition. From the old canvas purse, she used 4 coins the Indian had sent for practice iron, 1 Liberty nickel for lamp oil, a barber dime toward new muslin, and a silver quarter to buy cotton cord for the wheel. Every other coin went back into the purse. She wrapped the purse certificate's ledger and Elias's letter in fresh oilcloth, returned them to the handle slot, and added an envelope of her own. Across its face, she wrote 2 words. The next one. The shop reopened without an announcement. Sadie placed an index card on the corkboard inside Doris Vale's cafe. Iron button hooks, repaired and polished clothing tools made safe for cloth pay when work allows. The first customer mailed a rusted boot hook from Worcester. The second brought her grandmother's sewing scissors from Nashua. By spring, Doris kept a mailing list behind the register with more than 40 names written in pencil. Sadie accepted only the work she could complete carefully. Some customers paid in coins. Others left lamp oil, muslin, eggs, or bundles of clean rags. One mill widow sent nothing but a note saying the repaired hook had allowed her to fasten her winter boots without asking for help. Sadie entered the charges paid. Caleb returned in June, taller than the doorway and carrying a board wrapped in a blanket. He had carved a new sign from walnut following the surviving letters of the old one. Finch ironwork button hooks polished and repaired. Below those lines in smaller letters he had added, and daughters. Sadie ran her fingers across the final word. There has only been one daughter here for years, she said. Caleb rested the sign against the counter. His hands, once narrow around a splitting maul, were broad with sawdust caught in the creases. That is not what the word means. They hung it above the front door that afternoon. Caleb steadied the ladder while Sadie drove each nail with 3 strokes set drive finish. The sign faced the road, but the walnut branches partly concealed it. Travelers moving too quickly did not notice. Those searching for the room usually did. In October, Sadie opened the repair ledger to a blank page and began a letter. My dear one, whoever you are. She described the north rafter, the granite slab she had chosen not to lift, and the brass door in the walnut tree. She listed the mistakes that mattered: too much pressure on ebony, too little cure time in winter, 1 chimney patch mixed before the brick had dried. She wrote that Doris accepted payment in candles, that Caleb had understood the meaning of daughters, and that Reverend Boyd's 4-word prayer had outlasted every storm since. Then she explained the wheel. Do not polish until the iron shines like silver, she wrote. Stop when the burr is gone and the cloth is safe. Brightness is not the same as readiness. She folded the unfinished letter and placed it beneath Elias's. Years could pass before another person required it. Sadie did not fear that possibility. Waiting was part of careful work. The room had been waiting for her. At dusk, she closed the ledger, banked the stove, and tested the hook lying on the bench against a square of clean muslin. It crossed without resistance. Outside, the restored sign moved once in the river wind. The iron button hook polishing room waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Mrs. Agnes Wetherill eventually retired, leaving the brass-stamped deed ledgers and green-shaded lamp to her successor. The center desk drawer stuck whenever the weather turned damp. Beneath a stack of old filing forms, 1 worn dollar bill remained flat and undisturbed. The iron button hook polishing room waits. It has always waited.